Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in today for the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation's virtual policy forum on invasive species. My name is Ellery Tucker-Williams, Rocky Mountain State's Assistant Manager, coming to you live from Boise, Idaho, covering Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items to go over. First, the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation is recording today's presentation. However, any recording, rebroadcasting, or retransmission of this presentation or any of its parts without the written consent of CSF is prohibited. Second, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the program. So if you have any questions for our presenters, please direct them to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. With that out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce President of the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation for some welcome remarks, Mr. Jeff Crane. Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ellery. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm in hot, steamy Washington, D.C., and I'm talking about outside the U.S. Capitol, not inside the Capitol. But I want to welcome everybody. Special thanks to our panelists for joining us today. The Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation has been around for 33 years, starting with supporting the largest, most active bipartisan caucus in the United States Congress, the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, and we've expanded our scope and mission and role to include all the 50 states, first with the creation of a network of state legislative caucuses called the National Assembly of Sportsmen's Caucuses, and then most recently with the creation of a bipartisan governor's sportsmen's caucus that includes 30 of the sitting governors. So people like Ellery and Keeley and others on our staff are strategically located around the country to be able to access both of the states that are closest to them, but also bring their own backgrounds and areas of expertise. Today's topic is important for a lot of reasons, and I think at the outset, and a lot of the folks on the call probably realize this, that it can be sometimes misconstrued that sportsmen and women only care about game species and game fish. That couldn't be further from the truth. And as America's original conservationists and the primary financial supporters for a user pay public benefit system of conservation through Pittman Robertson, Dingle Johnson, the license fees that all of us that hunt and fish have to pay. We support financially a lot more than just game fish and game species. The habitats that the state agencies in particular and the federal public land agencies support habitat for all kinds of game and non-game species alike. And consequently, our involvement in conservation does include concerns about invasive species. And today we've got panelists with us that are going to talk in particular about three notorious species, being wild pigs, aquatic invasives, and then the infamous wild horse and burro issues that those of you in the Western landscape are familiar with. So we appreciate everybody joining. We encourage folks to be able to use the system set up here to ask questions and interact. And again, want to thank our panelists. And with that, I'll turn it over to Keeley. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jeff, for your remarks. And thank you again to everyone for joining us today. My name is Keeley Hopkins, and I'm the Pacific States Manager based in Portland, Oregon, and covering Alaska, California, Hawaii, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. Invasive species continue to be a primary threat to biodiversity, economies, and even human health. While the United States has a multitude of species that are classified as invasive, in this webinar, we'll be focusing on several species that have severe negative impacts on multiple levels. We have three excellent panelists joining us today to discuss the impact, management, and challenges associated with invasive species. We'll be hearing from Rebecca Stedson with the Coalition for Healthy Nevada Lands, Craig Martin with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and then we'll turn it over to Ellery to discuss wild pigs. And as Ellery mentioned earlier, we will have time for questions at the end of the program, so please be sure to drop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist, Craig Martin, who is the branch chief of aquatic species in the Fish and Aquatic Conservation Program at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. Craig, thank you for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to share my presentation. Okay, and do you see the presentation mode or the other? Good, okay. Well, I would like to thank you for the introduction and the invitation and for the opportunity to speak today to the Congressional Sportsman Foundation about managing invasive species. One of the key takeaways that I hope you take away from this presentation is the need for managing invasive species early in the invasion process. Too often, invasions have gained a foothold, and that is when we mount a robust response. I believe we must change this paradigm so that we get ahead of the invasion curve and catch them early. I would advocate that dealing with invasive species is a mission-critical function of CSF when working to protect and advance your organization's objectives for hunting and angling. Species like giant Sylvinia can degrade and clog water bodies in which boating and recreational fishing depends. Invasive carp can compose upwards of 60% of the fish biomass in some areas of the Mississippi River Basin and be boating hazards by becoming 50-pound projectiles. Quagga and zebra mussels have caused significant food web and ecosystem disruptions and can foul boating equipment. Without sea lamprey control in the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain, salmon and trout fisheries worth billions today could not have been reestablished or become sustainable. Finally, invasive species degrade boating experiences with time lost at watercraft inspection and decontamination stations. They increase boating expenses and can even cause water closures. Managing invasive species is well defined at the federal level. We have strategic plans at the Bureau, departmental, and even intergovernmental levels. These plans provide an excellent overview for how the federal government with partners are managing invasive species. The objectives of these plans are tied to resource outcomes desired from AIS management. And if I needed to boil these down into 4 different ones, I would, as I do here, prevent their introduction, in particular into the United States, implement nationally coordinated early detection and rapid response, contain their spread, and then manage their populations through population suppression. This slide goes into a little more detail about the invasion management process. If you look at the left, it's the classical definition of the stages of invasion. Once an organism is introduced, it survives, it establishes in the environment, it begins to spread, and then the very important aspect is it causes harm. As you move down that invasion process, the effort to manage and the level of harm increases. In the middle, we have the different management options. The first is prevention. We can prevent species from entering into the United States, and we can also prevent their spread from within. They're broken out into 2 separate components here. Then as a critical fail-safe to prevention, you can detect organisms early in that invasion process and rapidly respond, hopefully with things like eradicating those populations. Once they continue to spread, you're looking at containment, you keep them where they're at. And finally, down at the bottom, once they're widespread, you're looking at control, restoration, or even human adaptation. You're essentially living with those consequences. What's a very important relationship is this cost and efficiency on the right. As you manage earlier in the invasion process, you have much higher efficiency and far lower costs. And that's very important. And that is why prevention is so important and the gold standard for invasive species management. Members of the Congressional Sportsman Foundation can play an essential role. If we look at preventing the spread of invasive species within the United States, I'm hopeful that CSF members have heard about Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers or Clean, Drain, Dry. Cleaning, draining, and drying is the best management practice for water recreationalists to prevent movement of AIS between water bodies. Increasingly, we are seeing mandatory watercraft inspection and decontamination programs at water access points. We're also, however, seeing where industry is innovating and providing cleaning stations at boat accesses. I expect that this trend will continue into the future. Members can also play an important role in preventing introduction into the United States. Hunters and anglers are often aquarium or terrarium hobbyists. Non-native pets are a staple within the pet trade. We ask that hobbyists buy responsibly and never release pets to the environment. Invasive species managers classify two primary pathways that invasive species are introduced into the United States. They are the organism and trade and transportation pathway. This is a cargo ship, which is an example of the transportation pathway. Organisms can arrive in ballast water. They can be on ships of the hull in biofouling, or they can be on or and within the cargo itself. At the end of 2020, there were around 62,000 vessels in the world trading fleet with a total tonnage of over 2,000 million tons. By tonnage, the world fleet has doubled since 2005. Globalization has increased the number of people, goods, and services that are moving throughout the globe, and that moving is occurring at unprecedented rates. The movement of invasive species is certainly a 21st century problem. A recent economic study published in 2022 looked at the global costs for invasive species management. They found invasive species spending has grown by 2 orders of magnitude since 1960. Management delays on the global level have caused additional invasion costs of approximately 1.2 trillion when compared to scenarios with immediate management. These results indicate insufficient management globally at the pre-invasion management stage. The Fish and Wildlife Service has several key authorities to carry out prevention work by stopping species introductions into the United States. One example of this is the injurious wildlife provisions of the Lacey Act. This authority allows the service to list species as injurious under 18 USC 42, thereby prohibiting their importation into the United States. 307 species have been listed due to their invasive characteristics. 19 were listed after they had become established in US ecosystems. They include names that I hope and I'm sure you all are aware of. They include species like the northern snakehead, Burmese python, zebra and quagga mussels, black, silver, and bighead carp. All those were listed as injurious after they had become established in the United States. What you often don't hear about are the 288 species that were listed before they were established in the US. And this includes some of the species right here. The stone Morocco, it's one of Europe's most invasive fish. The brush-tailed possum, which was introduced in New Zealand in the 1800s for developing a fur trade, and it has dramatically changed the vegetation communities throughout New Zealand. The yabby, it's native to Australia, and its very scientific name should cause some concern. It's called Charax destructor. It got its name because of its burrowing ability, its ability to undermine levees, berms, and earthen dams. This data shows that 94% of all species listed were not established at the time of listing. But in my opinion, perhaps most impressive, none of them have become established since their listing. We can do better. We can indeed do better in managing these invasions. The president's FY23 budget includes an increase for this type of prevention work. moving on in that invasion stage, again, catching organisms early, EDRR is a comprehensive approach to defend the United States from newly arriving and establishing invasive species. It's existed on the landscape for many years, but it's often been focused on single species or maybe a specific geographic area, and it's never been knit together nationally. A nationally coordinated approach is one that has matured in the last decade, and it is ready for national implementation. The approach is well defined, and most recently, there was not 1, 2, or 3 journal publications, but a dozen that were published on the topic and clearly defined what was needed for a blueprint for national implementation. From top left and moving clockwise, the approach's foundation is horizon scanning so that we know what species are at greatest risk to the United States. It recognizes that if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. It leverages 21st century technology, such as molecular tools, to maximize detection efficiencies and capabilities. This is then expected to lead to detecting that needle in the haystack. It includes expedited response measures, so invasions are responded at the earliest point possible. It also includes funding mechanisms so that rapid is put into rapid response. The President's FY23 budget includes funding for a rapid response fund that can be used by states, tribes, and federal land management agencies to respond to land or to respond to new invasions on the landscape. Together, this approach serves as the fail-safe to prevention by eliminating infestations from the environment before spreading uncontrollably. In summary, AIS species are a 21st century problem. AIS can threaten CSF's mission by harming habitats, ecosystems, fish and wildlife populations, and recreational activities. Managing early in the invasion process provides significant returns on investment where management efficiencies are greatest and costs are minimized. Prevention and EDRR are key management strategies being pursued by the federal government with partners. 21st century approaches are needed to deal with this 21st century problem. Significant investments are being made at the federal level, and CSF membership can play an important role in prevention. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you again, Craig, for joining us. And with that, it's now my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague Ellery, who will start our discussion on some of the current challenges and opportunities related to wild pig management.
Thank you, Keely. And I just want to apologize to the group real quick for a quick change of presenters. Dr. Tomacek had a family emergency and was unable to attend this afternoon as planned. So I'm going to do my best to fill in for him and will draw on my vast wild pig knowledge. So here we go. My experience with wild pigs is somewhat in depth. I got my master's from Auburn University School of Forestry and Wildlife, looking at the human dimension side of wild pig management. So I am fairly familiar with this topic and have kept up with it since then. I also sit as the CSF liaison on the National Wild Pig Task Force, which its goal is essentially to try and find solutions to mitigate wild pig impact and also prevent further expansion of the wild pig populations. So if you haven't heard of the National Wild Pig Task Force, they have great resources. They're a wonderful group of very educated and involved individuals. So I'd highly suggest you look into them and all the work that they do to help try and prevent the spread of wild pigs. So with that, let me dive right on into things. What makes an invasive species first and foremost? This is what we're here to talk about today. Why is one species invasive compared to another that's not? In order for a species to be considered invasive, it has to have one or more criteria. It has to cause significant economic damage, significant public health damage or threaten public health, and have significant ecological impacts damage. Wild pigs hits all three of those, which makes it pretty bad here in the United States. Obviously, since it's an invasive, wild pigs don't come from the United States. They were actually originally introduced in the early 1500s by settlers and explorers as a known and reliable source of food. So they were brought over on the ships and kind of released so that way that they knew that they had a meat source there. Fast forward to today, we now have wild pigs in about 35 states total. Most of those are specifically in the southeast to southwest region, but we are seeing them pop up in Canada and coming down into Montana, as well as some of our northeastern states, and then little pockets of them in the Midwest. So how are these pigs getting to these places? You know, if it's a natural expansion, you kind of see it be just a blob that just slowly just kind of starts to dissipate into other areas. But we're seeing little pockets pop up, and how that's happening is that people are relocating them, translocating them, whether that be intentional, or people have, you know, enclosures, domestic pigs that get out that then create these free-ranging populations that then become feral. This is kind of how we're seeing these wild pigs spread. And when I discuss wild pigs, feral hogs, Eurasian boars, these are all the same species, just considered with different names. So what do wild pigs do that make them so terrible? If you're in the Southeast, you are very aware that wild pigs can be extremely detrimental to our agriculture and croplands. Not only do they damage crops and feed on them, but they also root up fields that cause damage to farming equipment that make it so these farmers are unable to actually harvest in their fields without threats to their equipment. They also destroy water resources through erosion and wallowing activities, which negatively impact our aquatic species and our water quality. They are known to carry, I think, around over 30 different diseases that are, some of them are transmissible to people, others aren't. Some of them directly threaten our domestic swine industries, which is obviously a very lucrative industry. So anything that's threatening that is definitely not a good thing. And they also negatively impact our tree plantations, pine tree plantations down in the South. They are known to root up and eat seedlings and eat the tap roots on those. And so that's also a big economic impact as well. From a wildlife perspective, wild pigs not only disrupt and kind of, what's the term? Push away other species. They also directly compete for resources. We've seen on trail cameras and other things where wild pigs will actually push away deer and turkey. It's kind of a running joke that if the wild pigs show up, the deer and turkey are gone. So that's a concern, obviously, when you have our native wildlife and game species, and you have another species that's kind of negatively impacting those. They are also known to depredate on ground nesting birds' eggs and reptiles and things like that. So all in all, they just kind of are really good at what they do. They're good at establishing themselves in different areas and really capitalizing on the environment in which they're placed in, which can be seen from the fact that they can and thrive anywhere from Canada to Alabama. So they're really good at surviving wherever they end up. And a common question that we hear is that, why can't we just hunt our way out of this situation, right? That's generally more often than not a decent approach. Unfortunately, wild pigs are extremely smart, and unfortunately, they are extremely fecund or highly reproductive animal. Wild pigs can, if under the right environmental conditions as well as the right dietary conditions, produce 3 litters within 15 months, averaging 6 piglets per litter. So when you think about it as a population scale, that is a significantly, an exponential population increase. So it's really hard just to hunt your way out of a situation like that. Once these pigs get hunted over a cornfield a couple times, they know the deal, they know what's going on, and they're extremely difficult to harvest or capture at that point. So what do we do about it? Essentially, what we have determined is that whole sounder removal is the best form of management for wild pigs if you have a population in your state. Whole sounder removal is basically when you try and take a corral trap, which is a giant corral more or less, that you then bait the entire family group known as a sounder into the enclosure. And then that is either has like a tripwire on it that once the pigs hit it, it drops, or there's some more fancy automated ones where it shows pictures and you can select from your cell phone when you want the gate to drop. So by capturing the whole family group, you're not only removing all of the pigs in that home range all at once, but you're also not necessarily educating them to the fact of hunting, and you're not educating them to trapping, because once a wild pig has been trapped and let loose, or has trapped and got out, or been failed in a trap, it's significantly more difficult to trap it again. So the whole sounder removal has been shown to be the most effective. Unfortunately, it is also extremely time and man hours, woman hours heavy. So it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and lots of times people don't necessarily have that capability to do so. So there's a lot of work that's currently being done to try and make whole sounder removal and trapping in some of our states that have well-established populations more accessible and easily and more financially obtainable. So in our southern states, it's a little bit different. There we're looking more at mitigating wild pig impact because essentially the wild pigs are there and they are well established, and the likelihood of completely eradicating them through whole sounder removal and hunting and our other techniques is fairly low. In the states with more initial populations that are just starting to be introduced, they're just starting to get established, the likelihood of eradication in that state is high. And similar to what Craig was mentioning, catch them early. That is by all means the same mantra with wild pigs. Once you have them, you can do your best to get rid of them and try and keep them from being established, because once they've got their foothold in the door, they're really difficult to get rid of. So some states have taken it upon themselves to pass different policies or regulations to try and reduce the likelihood of wild pigs being introduced into their states. That can be anything from making it illegal for individuals to transport and release wild pigs, or all the way to not having wild pigs listed as a game species to try and deter individuals who unknowingly want to increase the number of game species in their state and release them, not knowing that the type of negative impacts that they can cause. Again, not only economically, but also from a public safety, public health standpoint, and as well as an environmental and ecological standpoint. Wild pigs in general, an early estimate, just to give you an idea of the scale of their impact, was roughly $1.5 billion, but that was a wild estimate that was from a while ago, and we know that wild pigs have significantly expanded their range, and so it is estimated that that is on the very conservative end, and it is significantly higher to date. Two things that are currently in the works to try and come at this wild pig issue is toxicants. So there are currently two different wild pig specific toxicants that are undergoing EPA review and research. One is sodium nitrate and one is warfarin. Those have not been approved yet, but they are currently in the process of going through the review process. So individuals are hopeful that we might be able to have another tool in the toolbox to potentially reduce wild pigs populations and mitigate their impact, and kind of do a little bit better job of being able to reach some of those areas that are a little bit harder to with trapping. But obviously there are some ecological concerns and non-target concerns that are all trying to be worked out within the EPA process. So we're anxiously kind of waiting to see what comes of that, and if we're able to use some of those, and if they get them honed in enough that we'll be able to use them in the United States. I know there's currently a lot of success has been seen in Australia with the use of sodium nitrate and really putting a dent in wild pig numbers and wild pig impact. But again, we have to go through our processes here to make sure that we're not having negative impacts on non-targets, on water quality, soil, making sure that we have proper things in place to ensure that the toxicant use is being used effectively and properly to mitigate all of those concerns. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Keely. Hope you guys can bear with me on my off-the-cuff wild pig summation, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the chat, and that'll help kind of focus my thoughts here for you guys. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to you, Keely.
Thank you, Ellery, for stepping in there and giving us that excellent overview. It's now my pleasure to introduce our final panelist, Rebecca Stetson, who I have the pleasure of working with on wild horse issues in Nevada. Rebecca serves as the chair of the Coalition for Healthy Nevada Lands and will be joining us today to discuss the challenges of managing wild horses and burros and the steps that can be taken to help achieve more appropriate management levels. Rebecca, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Keely. I am, let's see if it'll, trying to start my video, but it says unable to start video.
You should be good to go now, Rebecca.
Okay. There we are. Thank you guys for joining us. So my name is Rebecca. I'm the chairwoman of the Coalition for Healthy Nevada Lands, Wildlife, and Free Roaming Horses and Burros. It's a long name, so we kind of chop it down to the Coalition for Healthy Nevada Lands. And I've been serving on this coalition for about 4 years. I'm a native Nevadan. I grew up riding horses and got really involved about 7 years ago when I was doing other conservation and stewardship work, and started to see when I would be talking to people about what were the biggest perils to Nevada's landscapes, there was a consistent theme that wild horses and their increasing numbers were a huge part of that. So I hope you guys have some great questions once I'm done. Let me see if I can share my screen adequately. All right, let me see if I can turn this into presenter mode. Right now, you guys are just seeing my PowerPoint, is that right? But not the way we want it to see.
Correct.
Okay, let's see here. This is always, it's always my favorite part. Well, we're just gonna go from here if you guys are all fine with that, because it's good enough. All right, so this is a pretty impactful picture. This is a picture of some horses in Nevada in a herd management area that necessitated emergency gathers, and clearly this is not the body condition that we would want any animal to look in unless it was really sickly. And that's what a chunk of horses are looking like here. So for those of you who are not super familiar with Nevada, we are home to 46,570 free roaming horses and burros. That's over 50% of the total horse and burro population across the whole nation. And horses double their population every 4 years. So you can imagine that when as this issue has been extremely politicized and romanticized over the past 50 years, horse numbers here are pretty high. Nevada is also the driest state in the nation, and we've been in drought for over 2 years, which has necessitated many emergency gathers over the course of the last 2 years. And across the United States, horses in long-term holding facilities, there's about over 50,000 horses, and that cost alone over the lifetime of those horses is going to be over $1 billion. So currently, what happens is BLM will say, you know, there's lots of herd management areas. These are the purple are herd management areas in the Western United States. You can see how Nevada has the majority of them. And so they look at the different herd management areas and say, okay, what is happening in those areas? How many horses are there? What is the appropriate management level or the carrying capacity of that land? And so then where do we need to prioritize doing gathers? And so once the BLM does gathers, those horses go into short-term holding facilities where they receive veterinary care. And if they're, mares or mothers who have just recently had babies, they stay in those short-term holding facilities a little bit longer until those babies are a little bit older. And then they go into long-term holding facilities, which are not in Nevada. They're in places where grass grows. So pastures in the Midwest and the East Coast. And those horses live out their entire life on those pastures. And so that, getting back to that figure, that's where that $1 billion across those 50,000 horses lifetime is, that, they don't have the same mortality rate as they would in the wild because they're eating the finest of food and living in a safe, protected area. So there are, in Nevada, these top pictures here are what some of the landscapes look like. So in this picture, you can see that this is what part of a Nevada ecosystem should look like. Over here is where it's been overgrazed and impacted. And these are horses that are digging out a spring area, trying to get to water. This is also horses trying to dig out a spring area to get to water. And so some folks will have the argument of, we should just leave all the horses on the land, they'll find water, et cetera. And this didn't happen in Nevada, but some years ago in Lake Powell, there was 200 horses found dead right next to a water source that had dried up. So those horses didn't travel to seek water. They just all kind of died where they stood. So why did horse populations get out of control? So there was a woman named Wild Horse Annie who started advocating for horses in the 60s and the early 70s. And what had happened is that ranchers, ever since we introduced modern agriculture in the United States, horses have been used. And so in ranching communities, it was tradition for horses to be let out every fall, and they would just live on the range with whatever wild horses were there. And then they would bring in the best of their stock in the spring, and they would use that stock. So it started ending up that there was an overabundance of horses because ranchers wouldn't bring in all their horses, horses are breeding, et cetera. And so there were some entrepreneurial folks called Mustangers who were starting to bring in those excess horses, and they would be utilized for and sold at the market for a variety of uses. That was meat for humans, meat for animals, and other products. So those Mustangers were pretty good at their job, and Wild Horse Annie started to be concerned that they were rounding up so many horses that wild horses would become extinct. The Mustang, as we know it, would no longer exist. So she started advocating for horses. And in 1971, she was successful in getting the Wild and Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act enacted at a federal level. And so there's some key terminology. If you've never looked at the act, I would highly encourage you to do so. In that act, it said that excess animals must be removed from an area to preserve and maintain a thriving natural ecological balance and multiple use relationship. And what we're seeing in Nevada and a variety of other Western states is that those excess animals have not been removed in the amounts that they could have been. And now we have a huge problem on our hands. And so that's kind of the where we're at in Nevada currently. So this is a pretty interesting graph for folks who are interested in wildlife. So here we have, I'm sorry, it's the next slide that you'll be more interested in. But this is data as of 2020, the Nevada high appropriate management level. So how many horses can sustain on our land is somewhere around 12,800. And that number has not changed. And so you can see how our populations are just skyrocketed out of control past that appropriate carrying capacity of the land. In this slide, this shows the amount, the comparable weight of big game versus horses and burros across Nevada as the years have gone on. And so what we're looking at here is like, based on the weight of an animal, how much do they consume? And then what is that in comparison to horses and burros? I do understand this graph does not account for cattle, which is an important part of this conversation. But just for the point of showing what big game comparatively to horses and burros are, we have that graph. So that in a nutshell is what we have going on. This is my contact information for anyone who wants to reach out and get more details. And I'll leave that up for a minute and then I'll go back to my camera. Things that folks from across the nation can do is there's really, even in Nevada, people are starting to understand the complexity of the issue, but this is not a well-known issue. And I will tell you from advocating on this issue, it is more contentious than gun rights. It's more contentious than abortion. It is the most politicized, romanticized issue I have ever worked on. And I love horses, but I also love ecosystems, and our ecosystem is in peril of ecosystem death as a result of increasing wildfires, increasing temperature, and lack of management. And so, and for those of you, I'm in Reno, Nevada, which is northern Nevada, and we're the fastest warming city in the nation, followed by Las Vegas and Phoenix, Arizona. That's the other one. So what can you do? We would love your help in circulating statewide sign-on letters that talk about supporting progressive wild horse management, research for more efficacious birth control programs, and then increased funding for management of horses, specifically in Nevada, because we don't get a commensurate amount of that chunk of money, even though we have the majority of the horses, so it makes management difficult. And the other thing that anyone can advocate for is to get out and adopt those horses. We need to take off more animals off of the range. And as taxpayers, we're just going to continue footing a huge bill because those horses are going to go into long-term holding and live out their life there. And so I find this issue to be very similar to, when we started having feral cat problems, and in other countries like Mexico, where there's huge feral dog problems, people really rallied and decided, okay, like maybe we don't need to buy a purebred dog. Maybe we can go out and adopt a dog from the pound, and which is significantly reduced the overall need to euthanize those animals. And it gives a quality of life to those animals. Does a horse really want to sit in a pasture doing nothing? I have no idea. I'm not a horse, but I imagine that getting some interaction is a greater way to live out a life. And in Nevada, we need more awareness across the United States of what the issue is here. So just educating you guys is a huge part of that. And then you empowering yourself to educate other people is another part of that. And I have some resources. I don't know if I'm just not, oh, here we go. So I will copy all these resources into the chat. That includes my contact information. And then there's a summit coming up called the Free Summit, and it's the Free Roaming Equine and Equid Summit in October in St. George, Utah. And that will be essentially a coalescing of everyone who does work on this issue. And so if you really want to get a deep dive of education, that is what I would recommend as a good use of your time. And last but not least, I thought it was pretty funny that we're going to use sodium nitrate to manage pigs, because sodium nitrate and its cousin sodium nitrite are what we use in bacon, sausage, jerky, etc. So maybe something for us all to noodle on when we eat those things.
All right, well, thank you again, Rebecca, for joining us. We now have some time to take a few questions from the audience. Again, please direct your questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so the first question for Craig. What would you consider to be the biggest challenge associated with aquatic invasive species?
So you want us to respond to those?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, so we've, I think as the presentation indicated, the lack of pre-invasion management is one of the biggest challenges that we face. Oftentimes an invasion occurs, the impacts are realized, and then it's all hands on board. And what the literature says and what the cost efficiencies and decreased management costs is that if you attack this issue early, that's where you receive the greatest returns on investments. And that's what I see as one of the biggest challenges at a national level: lack of pre-invasion management.
Thank you for that. So the next question, what are some action items that legislators can take in preventing the further spreading of wild pigs and wild horses? So Ellery, if you want to take that first and then go to Rebecca.
Sure. Essentially, see, I don't know if it's in here. Can you hear me? There we go. Internet problems today. Essentially, some things that legislators can do to prevent further spread of wild pigs, kind of what I mentioned before, is making it illegal to transport or be in possession of live wild pigs. That can be anywhere. We have, and the severity of those infractions or misdemeanor, whatever you want to label them as or qualify them as, is kind of up to obviously the discretion of the legislators and the bill language. But basically trying to take away any type of incentivization of bringing wild pigs to your state or further spread in your state. As Craig and I both mentioned, once they're there, it's a lot harder, but if you can kind of keep them from being there, that's your best bet. So making it illegal to transport live wild pigs, making it illegal to be just in possession of live wild pigs, not necessarily allowing a bounty program, because that can most times work against you actually in the long run. So those are a variety of different things. And then also making sure that, the state agencies that are responsible for enforcing those regulations, that they have enough money and individuals to actually be able to enforce those regulations. Otherwise it's kind of pointless or some more or less. So making sure that the programs themselves are well funded and well staffed to be able to do the research and do the work to be able to stop and catch some of these folks that are moving wild pigs around the states and in between states.
Rebecca, do you want to address what legislators could do on the wild horse issue?
Yeah, definitely. Well, legislators from other states could certainly educate each other if they're here, and could be talking about this. Essentially, our coalition right now is we're trying to get more money appropriated to Nevada. And the technicality is like, there's this big pot of money for the wild horse and burro program. And then depending on not only how many horses you have in your state, but how many horses you have in long-term holding, that's how money is divvied up. So because Nevada has always had the most horses, we have the most horses in long-term holding, which means that we get less money year over year from that overall pocket of money, because to actually do gathers and more horses, because more money is going towards the long-term care of those horses that are in holding. So that's what we're advocating for right now. But really, realistically, the general perception, I think, of the average person in the public is that horses are rounded up and then they're sent to slaughter, which is absolutely untrue. It's federally illegal to kill a wild horse. And so first and foremost, just educating yourself on what the Wild Horse and Burro Act is and helping us dispel that information, because BLM has been litigated against so much by extremist horse advocacy groups that they really have been stunted from doing the work that they could have done because of that pressure. And it's because the general public really just has no idea what's actually going on. But I mean, yeah, certainly statewide sign-on letters, Congress people talking to each other, representatives talking to each other would be super helpful. We are in communication with, Tracy Stone Manning, the BLM director, as well as our state director. BLM is moving forward. We've done quite a bit of gathers this year. Is it enough? It's essentially the more horses that are left every year, the more they reproduce, and then the more horses that are left on the range. And we are in what one of our coalition members likes to call a crisis-tunity, because these horses are dying an extremely inhumane death by dying of dehydration and starvation on the range. And so, yeah, if you could just spread the word that we're in drought, it's already the driest state in the nation. We have the most horses, and that it's really impacting the overall ecosystem, wildlife populations, the water resources, the land resources. And we're so prone to desertification anyways, that it is just, it's really, really a challenge that is really unknown at this point.
Thank you both. And Rebecca, that actually leads into the next question. With the drier conditions that you're seeing across the West, have you seen further harm in recent years to wild horses in the public lands compared to previous years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, drought takes a toll here pretty hard. And with, yeah, I mean, that first picture that I showed with that emaciated horse, that's not the reality of all horses in Nevada. And it's not the reality of horses right now at this time of year, but starting next month, and even, starting the beginning of August, when things get really hot and dry here, and all of that green up that came in has already been consumed. I have no doubt that we'll see additional emergency gathers. There's already been emergency gathers this year. There were emergency gathers last year. There were emergency gathers the year before that. So, yeah, it makes the most sense from an economic standpoint to gather as many horses as we can and get them off the land, to get it to the appropriate management level, so that not only the horses' health are preserved, but so that the land health and the water health and wildlife health is preserved. Because, like I said, desertification is a very real thing here, even without pressure. And so with that additional pressure, I mean, I don't know if any of you guys have owned horses, but as a horsewoman, my joke in my young 20s, I had dairy goats because they were the more affordable hay burner. Horses eat so much food, and they're not the same as a deer or a goat or another ungulate, where they waste so much of their food. It literally, like, only 40% of the protein is used through their digestive system, because they just have one stomach as comparative to other animals. So whatever we can do, the faster that we can do it, the most sense it makes all across the board.
Thank you, Rebecca. So the next question is for Ellery. Earlier you mentioned a pig bounty program. Do you have any insight on the Texas Wild Pig Bounty Program, and will we ever be able to eradicate wild pigs?
Right. Thank you, Keely. Great question. So the bounty program started off with nothing but great intentions, but it actually inadvertently created a situation in which it was economically desirable to maintain wild pigs on the landscape. So people started making money off of wild pigs through the bounty program. And so that actually de-incentivized eradicating them, because it started becoming an income source for the pigs. So it inadvertently created a market in Texas for keeping wild pigs around. That being said, the second part of the question, will we ever be able to get rid of wild pigs? That's a tough one. As I said, wild pigs reproduce extremely fast. They are extremely smart. And usually, I think we can mitigate a lot of their impact, and I think we can mitigate and reduce populations. but without some type of toxicant or some other tool in the toolbox to be able to kind of get at those populations that are a lot more difficult to reach or that have been educated to whole sounder removal or things of that nature, it's going to be really difficult in those states that have really established high population levels to fully eradicate them. Not saying that we can't ever do it, but we're going to need more effective tools to be able to remove more wild pigs quicker off of the landscape to be able to counteract the rate in which they are able to reproduce.
Thank you, Ellery. So one final question, so we're getting low on time here. For Rebecca, why do wild horses receive vet care, holding facilities, etc.? Who pays for it, and what makes horses different from hogs and other invasive species?
Great question. So, I mean, taxpayer dollars pays for it. We pay for it. And at the end of the day, it's because of a lack of action on all of our part. And maybe that lack of action is because of a lack of information. And the reason why horses are viewed different than other feral species is because our species evolved with horses. And people may argue this the way that they want, but there is a special relationship between humans and horses, not to mention the amount of us who read Black Beauty or whatever, you know, tons of horse books when we were little kids. Horses are beloved, and that has made it a really tricky scenario. And it's why, you know, in practicality, would it be practical to manage them more like any other feral species? That would be practical. But alas, here we are in the United States of America, and we have people who die from malnutrition who are obese, you know, and we have a huge food shortage issue, but we, you know, spend billions of dollars housing certain animals. So that's really, in my opinion, it's really neither here nor there. It's highly unlikely that the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971 is going to change to allow horses to be slaughtered. I don't see that happening with the level of education. And I think it's the same reason why we've seen hunting on a downslope, you know, for the last 20 years, is that people are so disconnected from nature that they don't even have a firm grasp on reality. You know, I'll have people say, well, you know, maybe it's more humane for them to die of dehydration and starvation. But I mean, there's just so many things there to unpack. But yeah, essentially, I don't think that they're ever going to be seen the same as feral hogs or as a feral invasive fish species or anything else. It is a matter of educating the public and using that beloved place that horses hold in all of our hearts, and using that narrative that they're suffering to get people to take action quickly.
All right, well, thank you. That wraps up all the time we have for the question and answer portion. So I'll now turn it over to Ellery for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Keely. Let's see here. If anyone has any lingering questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at CSF, and we will do our very best to answer them or connect you with the appropriate panelists to be able to answer them for you. For those of you who are interested in a more immersive experience on these and other sportsman-related policy topics, we encourage you to join us in Bozeman, Montana for the annual NASC Sportsman Legislator Summit from November 29th to December 2nd. This hallmark event for State Legislative Sportsmen's Caucus members and the broader sporting community will feature 3 days of policy discussions, demonstrations, and outdoor activities. Early bird registration is now open, and additional information can be found at www.nascsummit.org. Additionally, please be sure to mark your calendars for CSF's next and final virtual policy briefing on August 4th, titled Emergent Threats to Hunting and Wildlife from Misguided Opposition to Sustainable Forest Management on Public Lands. Thank you again to everyone and to our presenters, and we hope that you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.